Hello, we are here at the Ethics Experts. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a subscriber, welcome. Hope you're doing well. You look phenomenal today. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts, you get a bonus greeting on every single episode. I am here with Billy Hughes. Billy, how you doing, man?
Good, Nick. How are you?
Good. So yeah, I've been excited to get you on. You're somebody who I connected with on LinkedIn, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago.
Yep.
And you're just kind of a like-minded person who kind of sees you kind of see the fact that we are still all kind of in this nascent stage with respect to compliance. You're doing a lot to help inform people. And I'm just excited to get you on and pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah, for sure, man. I mean, I can talk a little bit about how I sort of got into this game if you want me
Perfect.
to
Yeah. That's a
give you
great
some
place to start.
background. Yeah, so for everybody, I'm a vice president at Gartner in our Gartner for Legal and Compliance Leaders product. Basically, all of our clients are chief compliance officers, general counsel, and chief privacy officers. And I've been doing this for my 13th year in the compliance and ethics field. And I spend most of my time talking to compliance officers about how to manage their team, how to build strategy, a lot about ethics and building the right culture. We also do a lot of cultural surveys at our company, so we've got some good data-based insights too. I think, like for me, like I think if you asked me 12 or 13 years ago, coming out of undergrad, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer and started working with general counsel. And then the more I got involved with the compliance side of the house, I think the more interesting I found it. I think there's a lot of like behavioral psychology in compliance and ethics, and I think it's pretty like accessible. Like I'm finding, like when I talk to clients every day, whatever challenge they're working on, whether it's training or getting people to speak up or getting leaders to care about ethics, like it's all very relatable. And like now that I'm a manager, like I think I probably feel it even more because I'm thinking
Right.
about that with my small team of 7 or 8 people.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting position that you're in at some level is the stuff that you're talking about with your clients, you like have to live out in the little, in whatever culture you're
Yes.
kind of a part of or an arbiter of or whatever.
Yeah. And so like this year, I've never thought about my team's mental health as
Yeah.
much as I have in the past. And
Same here,
people
by the
that,
way. Right.
like are quarantining or, have like loved ones that have gotten sick or, even people that are early career and are just sort of like by themselves in a studio apartment in Washington, D.C., where I am. Like, I worry about them a lot more than I did in the past because I don't see their eyeballs, every day or almost every day.
Yeah.
um, and I think that that's a big part of being a manager, and I think like ethics officers need to understand that that's the headspace that managers are in.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on it a little bit before, which I'd love to go back to, but like there's so much behavioral psychology and you said it's so accessible, both in the sense that like it's very actionable, but it's also very tangible, right? Like we're
Yes.
dealing with humans at the end of the day here. We're not dealing with a
Sure.
bunch of machines. So we have to tune into those things if the policies we're making or the initiatives that we're pushing are going to actually be effective and actually going to change the behaviors that we're sort of responsible for.
Yep, and we try to do that too. Like when we're looking at documents, codes of conduct, different types of policies that our clients create. Like a lot of the time, I'm reading it from a user experience perspective, UX
Yeah.
perspective, and it's a lot of times a document. If it's a code that was created when the company was incorporated, and it's black and white, and it's
Yeah.
looks
Yeah.
like a legal contract, and like how do you take that from base level to something that actually is helpful to read, gets you the answers to your questions, is in language that humans would actually use. I think that's a big part of it.
I find it a little bit hard to do that, and I've talked to some other folks who struggle with that, being able to sort of put on those different glasses or those different lenses. Like, how do you do that? How do you shortcut that, or like what tips do you have on that thing? You know what I'm saying?
On like writing
Well, I
compliance.
like, how do you look at it both from like, okay, the legalese perspective or the compliance perspective of, okay, do I have all the right information on here? And how do you also look at it sort of fresh, so to speak, from the eyes of someone who's maybe a line worker or maybe somebody who's on, who's very sort of, doesn't have that sort of legal style, which is kind of a lot of what's in the compliance game, that kind of thinking or thought? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you look at it fresh, like through a baby's eyes, so to speak?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple things. Like, I think you can shortcut it a little bit, and this is not the only way, but by looking at the reading level of the document.
Okay.
I can post a couple links in the episode or whatever, but
Yeah.
like there's an Hemingway app which will like help you cut down the text into sort of like a certain grade level,
Oh, cool.
and or so that your sentences don't have 6 different clauses in them like you see in your typical legal contract.
Yeah.
So that's an option. There's like there's a bunch of different tests that you can run on the language itself to make it sound a little bit more colloquial and less like legalese. So I'll dig a couple of those up. I also think like, you still want to get these documents reviewed by outside counsel in a lot of cases, but there's the document and then there's the learning aids that are attached to it, right?
Mhm.
So your buddy Ricardo would tell you all about this.
Right.
But like, you can have the rules, but you also have to have the examples along with it. And so like bulleted lists of things, examples of conflicts, examples of gifts that are, above nominal value, examples of what insider trading means or what fraud we're talking about. Like the examples are unbelievably useful, and sort of embedding them into the documents themselves, I think, goes a long way.
That's a great angle to not only like add some like, you know, more opportunities for effectiveness, but to just view whatever document we're talking about really more as a concept that we're trying to convey. And we have different goals for the conveyance of this information. One, we have to make sure that all the details are there for sure, but we also need to your point, translate that into something that's actionable for the person whose behavior we want influenced by this information. And I love kind of expanding from that sort of myopic view of like, okay, well, I just have a Word doc I have to push out there to say like, really, I have an attaché or I have a sort of portfolio of things that I need to deliver around this. And that leaves room for some of these broadcast style things that, you just alluded to, these specific examples that can translate this concept into a salesperson's, parlance, or into factory person's parlance, or just into their world to make that sort of relevant for them.
Yeah, two things to add to that. One would be, I think, if you're not thinking about the 3 to 5 questions that an employee would come with in their brain when they're looking for the document, you're doing it wrong. Like, why am I coming? Even with a code, it's like, can I accept this gift? Can I take this second job? Can I join this board? Like, where do I report something? Like, you have to be thinking about the 3 to 5 questions that are like the way that the employee gets to the document. And then you have to be able to answer those questions pretty quickly, or at least say in the upfront, here's where they're going to be answered in the body of this document. That's one. Second thing would be, I think thinking about your compliance risks as tracks is really useful. So it's not a course that you're launching on conflicts of interest or data privacy. It's a track that you're putting employees on throughout the year. So in Q1, I'm going to release my data privacy training. And then in Q2, I'm going to do a communication about confidential information to back that up. And then in Q3, I'm going to talk about what to do if you lose your laptop, or you think you might have a data breach, and I'm going to reinforce that part of it. It's a track. It's an information or data privacy track that you're building throughout the year rather than a tentpole event.
Right. Like a pillar. Hey, you
Yeah,
do this once, you sit through this for an hour, and then hopefully you remember it, 11 and a half months from now.
exactly. So I've got an information or security / data privacy track. I've got a culture track, and then I've got a, bribery and corruption track.
I love that, dude. That's
And
great.
you're thinking about, how do I keep reinforcing this message? Because all the research on adult learning that's out there says that by the time an employee has finished a compliance training course, even if it's a really good one, they've forgotten half of the stuff that's in it.
Right.
And
And
so
like, let alone 2 months from now.
yeah, it like atrophies really quickly. And actually, we've done some analysis where we've worked with some clients to look at their hotline data. So now back to your world,
Yeah.
where they've looked at all of the reports that are coming in from all the different channels,
Yep.
month by month, and sort of stepped them out, and then matched that with when their programmatic activities happen. So imagine like a bar
Yeah.
chart that goes month by month at the top, and then below it, something that says, here's where we released each of our training courses, here's where we released our communications, here's where our performance review cycle started, here's where our new CEO came in, like
Right.
those kinds of events, to try to draw not a causal relationship, but a correlation between the stuff that we're doing and the outcome, which is more reports. And you can, in a lot of companies, you can almost look at the activities driving spikes, and then the spike having a half-life where it sort of atrophies and gets back down to steady state after a couple months, which makes the track point as it's coming back down. I have to be able to do something else to be able to boost it again.
Well, and we saw exactly this thing that you're talking about with the Me Too movement, right? Like everybody had a massive spike in Me Too, style claims. And then to your point, there's this half-life to this thing that is somewhat tied to the presence of this thing in sort of the broader conversation and our broader sort of, zeitgeist or whatever. And then as that begins to dissipate, then you see that thing come down. I love the tracks idea. I love both of these ideas, frankly. Like the tracks idea can give you that that direct way to fight against the forgetting curve, which to your point is super brutal. You spend all this money on a course, or you spend all this money sort of designing something that's relevant to folks, and puts it in their world and puts it in their makes it relevant for them. And then to your point, 2 months later, 90% of it's forgotten or something like that. So that's great. But I love also, I think, again, as compliance continues to grow, more of this sort of cross-pollination and sort of corroboration of a given trend and looking for correlation elsewhere is going to allow us to sort of accelerate our insights. And I just love that, just what that visual would look like, kind of this timeline of major sort of corporate events or initiatives that are launched, and how is that showing up elsewhere. So not only for ourselves is that great to know, like, well, what efforts are giving me the bang for the buck? Where do I need to layer more in? But now we have something direct that we can point to if we ever get audited, or we're in any sort of circumstance where we have to defend sort of our at least eye toward the effectiveness of it. This is a 2-point at least program to sort of see how that relationship exists.
Yep, and I think it just helps you have a better conversation with the board if you're the CCO. I look at a lot of board reports, and many of them, they're very focused on what happened and not so much on the why it happened. And I think the more that you can get to the why, even like hypotheses about the why, not things that definitely are the reason why something happened, the better conversation you're going to be having with directors in the room when you're talking about something as complex as hotline data.
Yeah, and if we can just stay on that for a second, I think to your point, when we're talking about the why, even if you're hypothesizing, even if we're just there's a couple of messages that are being conveyed there. When you're talking about the why, you have to sort of tell a story, and we're all kind of wired for stories. So those conversations are automatically a lot more engaging, first of all. To the extent that you're fighting, or you're kind of swimming upstream from a perception problem with the board as to whether or not they recognize the value of our function in a broader sort of cultural sense, which I think we'll talk about some more in a second. You can at least exhibit like, hey, I'm not just standing up here reading you a bunch of information that you're just going to flip through. I'm not just reading you a bunch of numbers. I'm telling you a story, and I'm also exhibiting sort of this this sort of critical approach, or this critical thinking approach to trying to understand with a higher confidence interval what the efficacy of our programs are, and what the sort of the externalities or the implications of these things are in terms of the behavior, which again makes it so much more tangible for them to understand, and easier to point to the thing that they care most about, which is probably the bottom line at that level.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the 201, 301 version of it is, in your board report, or when you're talking to your board, you're hitting 3 beats. You're hitting what happened, why it happened, and then what next.
Yep.
And if you're really good, the what next sort of includes a bit of a call to action, like what decision do I want you to help me make, or what do I want you to know so that you can help me make the decision. But like I said, a lot of them are very focused on the what. So I think that's a place where a lot of compliance teams can get better.
So that's great. So you were talking about, hey, let's think about the 3 to 5 questions. Let's look at tracks, and I think you were about to talk about another one too.
Well, let's you want to pivot and talk about, like, I think we talk about culture in the COVID environment a little bit.
Okay, yeah,
I think that's like, we're going to be living in this world for quite a long time. Vaccine or no vaccine, I think it's good to think about like what's changed this year, and will some of it go back to status quo, or have some of these changes sort of happened they're going to stick. They're going to be permanent. And so I wanted to share a couple of data points, maybe just to start. So
Yeah, great.
we did some research way back in 2012 at Gartner, where we looked at career moments. So what percentage of employees at large, mostly US companies, are facing various events in any given year. So we looked at things like how many employees face organizational restructuring, layoffs, change in job responsibilities, change in senior leaders, wage freezes, M&A, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And as you can imagine, it's a pretty big percentage of employees that are facing those changes in any given year. So I'll take one. Let's look at restructuring. So back in 2012, 20% of employees told us that their company was doing restructuring or had done it in the last year and that it had affected them.
Okay.
8 years later, this year, it was 50%. 50% of employees said that their company did some kind of restructuring that affected them over the course of the pandemic. With layoffs in 2012, it was 21% of employees had experienced layoffs in the last 12 months. This year, it was 29%. So pretty big uptick there too. And that's pretty much across the board when you look at these career moments.
Yeah.
And the insight is not that they're happening, it's that they stack up on top of each other and they actually have a really big effect on employees as they stack.
They're not
So
additive, they're multiplicative or something.
exactly. So like, if imagine yourself, right? So I'm in a company and there's restructuring and I kind of roll with it. And, then I have a change in my job responsibilities.
Yeah.
Then there's layoffs in my business unit. Then my wages get frozen. Those things stack up and up and up. And so as they stack, you see more employees actually observing misconduct and you see a lower perception of the company's integrity as they're happening. And there's some ways to sort of get in front of those bad outcomes, but we've observed a really big effect on both of those.
That is super interesting. So I think it's kind of counterintuitive, at least with respect to. I mean, there was so much speculation earlier in the year. I mean, this is the year of speculation that
Sure.
we've all been wrong about. But there's so much speculation, and I remember having some conversations probably like around June when we were talking about like how long is this thing going to go, and some folks were just thinking like, well, sort of like integrity risk might be going down because everyone's working from home, and there's less sort of opportunity for sort of integrity issues. So that, again, this is probably a balance and there's probably no sort of silver bullet right answer. But while that may be true, to your point, the confluence of all these other sort of career moment things that stack up and the uptick in, material uptick, by the way, it sounds like on every single one of them counteracts whatever sort of reduction in opportunity for misconduct. And to your point, can actually outweigh that and provide an opportunity for more misconduct, right? It can be a catalyst for more of it.
Yep. We saw when we did this back in 2012, we looked at a couple of individual risks like inappropriate giving, bribery, fraud, insider trading, and there was about a 5 percentage point bump in how often employees are seeing those very serious types of misconduct.
Wow.
If they had experienced more of the moments in a given year. So it's not just theoretical, like it actually applies to some of the individual risk areas too. I mean, the other thing I would tell you too is like we did some polling back in May timeframe on a web. So this is beginning to middle of us dealing with a pandemic, or at least getting used to it. And we asked the question like, have you seen an uptick in your hotline volume as a result of this, or in the last couple months? And it was almost an exact bell curve. You had some companies that were lower, some companies that were higher, and a lot of companies that were like, yeah, it's about the same. And when we did some analysis of it, like it broke down kind of how you'd think by industry. The companies that had more employees back to work or that had been working the whole time because they're manufacturing PPE, they had a lot more reports because a lot of them were about safety. The companies that had sent everybody home and were totally virtual and are in business services, maybe a little bit less on the report. So I think it was almost a bell curve on the reporting data, but I think it doesn't change the fact that these moments are stacking up for employees as companies deal with the pandemic, and there is a psychological effect, like you're wearing them down over time. And so every time there's a new event that happens, they have less and less ability to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think perhaps tell me what you think. I mean, it obviously makes sense that your survey was like relegated to work stuff. But these things are just human things that happen to happen in work. And this has obviously been like a extremely difficult year on many fronts, in the social front, political front, and all that other stuff. All those other things start to kind of stack in there
Oh
too.
yeah.
So, I mean, how do you view that from a, like you run a team? How has sort of this information that you're gathering from, this massive data pool, either like reconfirmed some of your own management approaches, or like how have like some of your things changed in this year or in the last few months, you know what I'm saying, in terms of,
Yeah.
caring
I'm
for your team,
thinking,
things like that?
I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know about reconfirmed. I think it probably all of those events that you just mentioned, I think they probably made me question my management approach more than
Oh,
anything.
interesting. In
Um,
what way?
Not question as in like I want to do something differently, but more like, am I doing enough? Do I need to
I
get
see.
better at talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do I need to get
Yeah.
better at talking about Black Lives Matter? Do I need to get better at talking about politics, or at least being able to respond correctly when it comes up in
Right.
conversation and like create that kind of safe space? I think the biggest thing I mentioned earlier has just been worrying about mental health and checking in on people's mental health, not just like their work product, like not just what they create, but how they're feeling, has been a bit of a shift in the way that I run like my one-on-ones with my team. I think that's really important, is to like keep people healthy and not burn them out, because I think that's one of the things, specifically for maybe companies like ours. Um, you're never off the clock now. Like,
Yeah.
you can answer
There's no
email at all
escape.
times of night,
Yeah.
and I'm working from the same place that I cook dinner. And I think that it's even harder to separate work and life. And I think, work-life balance is sort of an overused term and maybe a bit of a fantasy sometimes, but
Totally.
you have to draw boundaries. Like, this is like a super tactical thing, but about 6 months ago, I took my work email off my phone.
Wow.
Like, I couldn't have it in my pocket all the time and constantly check it. And I'm not saying I don't like go back to my email and look at things after work. I certainly do, but I try to do it at like defined times, knowing that like maybe what I do is important. I'm not a heart surgeon, and like I'm not on call. I'm not on
There's not
call,
lives hanging in the
and like
balance.
it can
Yeah.
wait like 30 minutes or 60 minutes, or it can wait till like I finish having dinner to like look at my email and respond to something, even if it's from my team. And if they need me, they can text me. They all have my line for emergencies. I still have Teams on my phone, so it's a bit cheating to say like I don't do it all, because I still have that. But at least like for me, I
It's a
needed
little
to find
different. It's a bit
one
of a
boundary.
yeah, yeah. So how
Yeah.
have you seen that change like your quality of life, or your own mental health, or your own, to your point, I mean, like we talk about work-life balance, it doesn't really exist. The most we can sort of shoot for is some kind of work-life harmony. So how has that changed the harmony of your life,
I mean, I feel like there's so much going on this year that it's difficult to say like I've got it in perfect harmony. The Zen master over here. But I think that I'm more present because of it. And I think that now we're getting into like mindfulness territory, but
Yeah.
I think that's right. Like I think you want to be there in the moment. You want to be able to do stuff. You don't always want to be worrying about it and like working yourself up to into a ball of stress. Even if you don't feel like that, I can guarantee you that managers or individuals on your team feel like that.
Right.
And so it's sort of like a practice what you preach thing. Like I want to be able to draw boundaries, and then I also want to give my team the rope to draw their own boundaries.
Yeah, I love that picture actually, because at some level they're setting their clock to your watch, right? So
Yeah.
whatever you're modeling, they're at least going to take that stimulus in as some information. And if in this sort of heightened environment where stress is increased and career moments are stacking on top of each other, and these boundaries that we used to have, at least physical, right, in terms of working from home and stuff like that, have dissipated, um, at least being that beacon of, or at least trying to model what you want them to, feel, is at least some tailwinds toward that goal.
Yeah, I mean, it's trying at least.
Yeah.
I would say like, maybe a couple things that are bigger than just me, but that companies can do on the manager side. Um, I've seen a lot of clients that have pivoted to, you have to figure out how to do communications and training remotely,
Yeah.
and what that looks like. I think you have to do a better job at putting, um, tools in a box into managers' hands to be able to use them versus making them create their own stuff or doing something that's like one size fits all. I think you have to respond to the career moments when they happen. Like you have to give managers talking points on what to say about them, because if in a vacuum, employees create their own story about what's happening.
Right.
And then I think you have to, like, as we're talking about, get your managers to do a little bit of self-examination about their own behavior.
Okay.
So I can talk about a couple of those things, but what interests you from that long list?
Well, I just noted like 2 or 3 of those things. So I'd like to actually dive into all of them. Let's start with like the toolbox. You said give these guys some tools, and then you kind of went on to say, which I think is kind of an extension of it. So like you don't have to reinvent it yourself. And also maybe here are some talking points. Like just tell me some more about that. Give them tools or make their lives easier, tip.
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do it, but I'll start with an example. So one of the clients that we work with is Philips, big electronics company. And one of the things that they've been working on for the last couple of years is better manager training. And so their version of that in 2020 has been to create a set of scenarios. So they have a library of, let's say, roughly 25 ethical scenarios, some of which are pandemic specific.
Cool.
And they've gone out to their managers and said, answer 3 questions about you. How big is your team? What kind of business unit are you in? Maybe what region of the world are you in? And we'll tell you which of these scenarios are going to be best to be able to use with your team. So they're tailoring
Great.
it a little bit, putting it in their hands, saying you're welcome to adapt it slightly. And then after you have a discussion with your team about what they would do in this ethical scenario, report back to us and tell us what their feedback was. And they actually have a forum for managers to talk to each other, having run some of these. They call them dialogue sessions, and they've had some crazy astronomical number of managers that have actually done it at their company. I think there's a little bit of like peer pressure too. So they advertised how many managers were doing it, and then more managers wanted to do it, and
Yeah.
that's like
That's a whole behavioral psychology thing in and of itself. Yeah.
yes, it's a signaling thing, but it's also a virtuous cycle, not a, this is like a good thing, but
Yeah.
the good kind of peer pressure.
Right.
So I think that's a good example of resources in a box that can actually help managers think through some of these things. What
So
else
let's
from the
talk
list?
about so that's kind of the nirvana on the spectrum. The other side is maybe the company not doing anything at all, right? Like talk about something in the middle. I think if we can find some kind of a midpoint example, then maybe there's some, someone can be like, oh, here's a light bulb moment for me to kind of push it toward that,
That's a good joke there, a hidden joke there with the light bulb moment, since we're talking about Philips. No, I think what would be in the middle? I think like just some basic talking points. Hey, this happened. Getting to your managers early and saying like, here's 3 bullets that you could talk about with your team, so that you're, again, filling the vacuum, right? I had a compliance officer tell me one time that when they fired somebody for an ethics issue, it actually had like a huge impact on the team around them, because they didn't say anything, and it was like the person had been abducted by aliens.
yeah, gone, never to be
And
spoken of again.
and
Yeah.
then like the managers didn't know how to talk about it, and so there has to be some coaching at the end of either a localized issue like that or a big company event that says like, here's what you should be talking about as a manager. And even better if you can say, here's a couple of talking points. You don't want to standardize too much. So you don't want to say like, these are the only 3 things that you can
Right.
say, but you want to say like, this is the flavor of the 3 things that would be best to talk about with your team. And if you get additional questions, don't try to answer them yourselves. Like, come back to this centralized place and we'll get you answers. That's a big portion of it.
And that's a great example of how, this sort of third line department that, we're all kind of serving and being a part of can really add a lot of value to the organization at large, right? Like the more value that we can provide to other departments, other managers and so forth, the quicker we're going to be able to kind of address this branding problem where everybody thinks compliance is just the island of Dr. No, the monster from the island of Dr. No.
Yeah.
By serving it up and making that a little bit easier for folks to like have those talking points and being able to put it in their own words and not feel shackled by them, but really empowered by them to address issues that maybe are thorny or maybe are a little bit hairy, I think can really, really help accelerate this branding change that we're all kind of trying to accelerate through,
I agree.
So you talked about, another thing you talked about is like, well, this is kind of getting over into mindfulness. And you kind of talked about, a manager should kind of spend some time on self-reflection. I'd love to dive into that a little bit more because I think mindfulness kind of gets kind of a hokey,
Yeah.
it has the wrong connotation because what we're talking about is presence, and what we're talking about is just kind of being here in the moment and not being overwhelmed by the stimulus around us and the things that we can't control and so forth, kind of getting a better understanding of what that barrier is. And some of those things are kind of foundational elements, not only for our own sort of more effective behavior, but also foundational elements in building a strong culture that people feel included in and not overwhelmed by and so forth.
I think that's all right. For what it's worth, I've never had any particular success with some of the mindfulness stuff. My version of that is probably like getting on the Peloton and like wearing myself out. But I think that like there is something to some kind of self-examination of your behavior. So we have a client, Centerpoint Energy, who does what they call these manager mini diagnostics. So basically, they send out communications to some of their managers on a regular cadence, and they try to be a little bit provocative or clickbaity with the subject line. So it'll say something like, "Do you really have an open door policy?" Or, like, "What would you do if an employee asked to take a second job?"
Right.
Questions like that that maybe are a little bit edgy, or at least would like spark some self-reflection. And then, assuming the manager clicks on the email and opens it, they get some talking points on what to do in that situation, and what the appropriate behavior is. So it has the tool in a box component plus the
Great.
self behavior examination component, and they got some ridiculous click rate, like 97% open rate on some of the emails that they've sent,
Wow.
which for any of us that send emails to anybody,
Right.
that's off the charts. Um, so that's like a tactic, sort of in this self-examination mindfulness space, making people think about themselves in a compliance ethics context. But actually, I'll throw it to you. Like, since you picked up on it, like, have you found any kind of success in that? Have you been doing your own sort of self-examination this year?
Yeah, I just climbed to the top of a mountain and I just pictured a leaf floating down the river. I'm kidding. I think just kind of, so I'm going to kind of talk around it because I'm kind of the same as you. Like, I don't meditate or anything like that, but I just think us broadly as an organization, we've had some phenomenal success bringing in people for like day sessions. We brought in we brought in like a life coach, and we had a whole day session talking about things and talking about perspective. That was really kind of like right as COVID was kind of right about to kick off. Subsequent to that, we had a couple day session with a psychiatrist who we brought in, like an organizational psychiatrist. And we also carved out time for folks if they wanted to go and talk to somebody, because like this was like at the height of all the racial stuff, all the political stuff, all the COVID stuff. Like, to your point, like this stuff stacks and it multiplies. So what we found is just like, and again, this is so basic, man, but like on the human to human basis, how do you make connection? You make connection through vulnerability and authenticity and building trust, right? So like,
Yep.
to the extent that we've been able to model that both sort of corporately by bringing these people in and, letting people know that, hey, I hear you, like we're all going through something difficult. We want to at least help in some way. If you need to take like a personal day, fine, take it. If you want some time with this person, go ahead, whatever, right? Like just to be that support. So that was kind of the primary message, which I think we had some great sort of like cultural, wins from. But I think the secondary message is just the fact that we're talking about it, and just the fact that like we're not walking around with a stiff upper lip, like, hey, nothing's bothering us. Like, dude, we're all going through something that we've never gone through before. So just talking about it and saying like, yeah, this is hard and this is hard for me and I'm battling with this and so forth, allows people to kind of bring their whole selves a little bit more. And that's just one less thing for the anxiety algorithm in our brain to worry about. Like,
Yep.
there's so many cultures, at least that I've been a part of prior to where I'm at now, where like, God forbid you show any weakness. God forbid you're going through anything, hard, and you show any freaking sign of weakness. And then, that's like a death knell or something like that. You know what I'm
I
saying?
know. Like, yeah. Yes. Like, this is not Silicon Valley. Like, we don't need like the Amazon like PIP culture, performance improvement plan culture. Like, work 70 hours a week until you drop and then go do something else. Like, it's
Well, it's
not
just
the
not
kind of culture that
sustainable.
I'm trying to build. I also think like there's something to analyzing your own behavior, but there's also like analyzing your own, this is going to sound really new age now, analyzing your own energy compared to everybody else's energy
It's
around
true,
you, because
man. No, but it's true.
there are definitely different types, right? I'd recommend, if anybody wants to Google this, there's a sort of like Myers-Briggs type assessment called Insights,
Mm.
um, where it sort of asks you 50 or 60 different questions about what you like to do and how you communicate with others. And then they group you, believe it or not, into like red energy, blue energy, green energy, yellow energy, and they all have different
Okay.
personas. And I actually found it pretty helpful in understanding like, where does my team fall and what do they take energy from, and then what saps their energy. Um,
It's a
and
big deal,
then,
man. It's
so that
it's a
that's a
real
good one.
thing. Yeah, yeah. So you were gonna say though, so how did you like how did that sort of start to influence things, and how do you like do you view it on a sort of an aggregate team basis and or also on an individual basis? And
Both intra team and and between other teams. So
oh,
like
okay.
on my team, I have a lot of people that would be in what Insights would call the red category. Like they're drivers. Um, they're very like task based, uh, self starters. These are mostly good things.
Yeah, yeah.
Want to get things done, like meetings that have agendas. That's like their sort of personality.
Right.
I also have a few people that would be more in what Insights would call like the yellow category, which is like very diplomatic, searching for consensus, and always trying to make sure that nobody's feelings are hurt. And like those two groups tend to conflict with each other a little bit naturally, because one is
Right.
like, what's the decision that we're making? And the other one is like, is everybody on board?
Right.
And so that is interesting. And then if you take my team, which is the advisory team, so the client facing advisory team, versus like our research team, they are much more analytical, data
Mm.
driven, want to make sure that anything that is said is sort of backed up by numbers, and that there's a hard basis for being able to make some of the claims that we make, which is also a good thing. But because of that, they might be a little bit slower to act. And I think that frustrates some people on my team because they want to go full bore every
Let's
time. And so it's
go.
just like understanding some of those conflicts between teams, I think is really useful.
Yeah, it is extremely useful, and I think kind of translating this to the compliance side, just opening our minds to the fact that these differences exist, the fact that sort of different departments are going to have this clustering of a certain, to use this framework, a color, can open our minds from an efficacy perspective to say like, okay, well, this policy I'm pushing out or whatever, it's got to, I got to feed the yellows over here. I got to feed the reds on the sales team. I got to feed the blues in R&D. And I have to account for these different things. And these differences are not bad, to your point. These are all complementary, and it's where the magic can come in from, specialization and complementarity in a broader system of people pursuing a one goal, at least in theory, together. Just opening our minds to that dimension of the game beyond, hey, does this document have all the proper legalese, and do I have the proper lines drawn around the perimeter of this rule or this policy? I think is extremely freeing, and it just is such a catalyst for effectiveness, which is what I think this next decade we're really going to see an acceleration toward.
100%. Yeah. I mean, even like a quick client example, this is Dell's compliance team, who is exceptional at a lot of the things they do. Alicia
Yeah.
Olmstead is one of the people on that team that leads it. They've like built some training just for their sales team, because of exactly what we're talking about. Like, I needed to get down to like the sales vernacular to be able to take something like conflicts or bribery or corruption or fraud and talk about it in like sales language with their whatever green energy.
Right.
And I think that that's right. Like, I think figuring out who your high risk groups are and then tailoring your content to the way that they're going to come to the compliance and ethics conversation, is very smart. I don't think you can do it for every group because it would be like cost prohibitive and time prohibitive.
Sure.
But there are things like, if you know where the risk is, that's where you should put your extra dollars and time in terms of tailoring the content.
Yeah, that's a really good point. where do you see, like, you deal with some really large companies, and some of these larger companies, they're always at kind of the cutting edge of the stuff, right? Like they're at, we're kind of pioneering this whole function because 30 years ago, it didn't even really exist. There's still a lot of change, and we're still sort of finding our identity and our role within the organizations as we fight these, these derogatory labels of cost center and stuff like that. Your larger organizations that are at this cutting edge, what do you see that they're like, what is the difference in an organization where compliance is empowered versus one where they're still kind of swimming upstream and they don't get the respect in terms of resources, budget, whatever, that other folks are getting?
Yeah. What is the difference? I think the difference is that at some of the organizations where they're not getting the respect, compliance has been pigeonholed into regulatory compliance.
Mm,
It's your job is to make sure that the company doesn't run afoul of any of these laws, guidance, regulations, and report out on whether we're doing that or not, as opposed to the compliance and ethics job, which is like I had a compliance officer. Actually, I think this was at one of Compliance Week's events or SCCE's events earlier in the year, but there was a gentleman that was speaking and he said, like, my job as a compliance officer is I'm the chief of making sure that the company lives up to who it says it is. And like, I mean, I love that. I think
that's
like
a perfect, that should be the mandate.
yeah, I mean, I think some HR officers would like to have that as their mandate too. But I think you want to get closer and closer to that, where it's not just the regulations, it's the employee behavior, it's making sure that people speak up, it's making sure there's a sense of organizational justice, it's caring about how you train managers, to our earlier conversation.
Right.
Like you have to sort of expand your mandate. And I think, you know, anybody that has ethics in their title this year, 2020, is thinking about expanding it even more. So I've gotten tons of questions from clients about how do we work with our diversity and inclusion group? How do I get involved in ESG if our company is claiming that we're going to be, carbon neutral or carbon negative? Like, I think the compliance ethics field will continue to expand, but for the people that aren't there yet, you should try to lift the conversation from regulatory compliance to sort of corporate compliance, DOJ guidance, federal sentencing guidelines compliance first, and then you're on your path towards like chief of making sure the company does what it says it's going to do.
That's a great path. How much of the endorsement from the top is affectable by someone at this kiddie table or at this sort of cost center, or how do we influence that on a more kind of consistent or kind of accelerated basis?
Yep, I think it depends, and there's a couple callbacks here too. I think like it depends on the company, and hopefully you feel like you've got buy-in from the top CEO, GC level if you're head of compliance. How do you win them over? I think it's not just talking about the what, talking about the why, and making them look good when they're in conversations about why the company should go in a certain direction or why the company should make an investment. If you're just talking to them about the 7% year-over-year increase in hotline calls, that's not the right conversation. You should be talking to them about why we're seeing new types of issues coming in and what we can do about it and how that matters to making employees more productive and making them feel safer. That's the conversation that you want to be having. So it's a little bit of like, there's a little bit of like how to win friends and influence people stuff in here. I don't know if that was in your 76 books for the year or whatever you're on now.
That was last year. So
there you go. But I think there's a little bit of strategy to how you talk about the things that you do. And I think it's definitely that why over what. And then just like using your time effectively too, and not getting bogged down in the minutia and trying to spend extra time thinking strategically so that you can go into that conversation with your GC armed with the right data is helpful too.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with these 4 colors thing, but
Yeah.
it seems like some of the skills needed for this ascension are really influence skills that might be more sort of concentrated or more naturally exhibited by somebody in, say, the green category. Whereas, the average compliance group, if all compliance teams, ethics and compliance teams took it, maybe they'd be in a blue category. So some of these things are maybe not natural, but to your point, they are all human and they're all in us. And we do exhibit them with our neighbor or with our friend on our golf team or whatever, right? Like we exhibit these influence things with our wife when we don't want to get sushi or something. You know what I'm saying? Like we just need to bring that stuff and unleash it in our organization. Why do you think it's hard for our type, so to speak, to do that? Why do you feel like we're still confined by this thing?
I think it's hard to flex. So a lot of the insights research, that's the thing with the colors. It's just capital I insights if you Google it. But what they say is teams have to include all of the things, red, green, blue, yellow, right? And if the team is all red, like all the compliance people are the same type of person, somebody has to flex into the other roles to be able to make the team work. And flexing is hard. And the other part of it is it's really difficult to flex into a role that isn't natural for you when you're stressed out. And so if you think about 2020, like people's ability to flex into being a consensus builder or a cheerleader or somebody that is very data driven, if they're not, that is nada, right? Because I gotta, like, my kids are home and I'm trying to figure out how to school them, and worried about the budget, and I'm worried about my job, and I'm worried about having a quarantine. Like there's just all kinds of things that I think are to the point about things stacking up, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And so I think it's difficult for people to flex into what they need to be able to be a better influencer, especially in this year. And so, take your email off your phone. Like give yourself some space. Give yourself some space to like get rid of some of that stress, because I think if you do, you're going to be a better influencer and you'll be able to have that strategic conversation with the GC or CEO.
You just made such a point that I just haven't even thought of. I've just looked at, maybe because I'm a red, I'm just kidding. I don't know what color I am, but like I've looked at this year as like, wow, this is really our year. We have such an opportunity to show what else we can do, because we're in this unique position. We sort of weave through all the different departments and all the different silos in our organization. We have the opportunity to expand the mandate to this really sort of romantic thing that's actually actionable to, help the company live up to this thing that it's supposed to be. We can affect culture, affect people. But there's this huge opportunity because of all of this, chaos that's going on that we're all kind of trying to navigate through. But then counteracting that, to the point you just made, is, well, it's harder for us to take advantage of the opportunity because of all of our own stress and all our own things stacking up. It's just as with everything in life, right? Like nothing's easy, nothing's simple. And every opportunity, every door, you got to walk through it, right? And sometimes it's harder to even crack that door open or to kind of get up and get moving.
Yep. On the opportunity thing, I'll say, like, I've seen a number of compliance teams seize a little bit of the opportunity in the sense that they're getting involved. I mentioned DEI, but they're getting involved in other things that they haven't yet gotten involved in before. So an example would be environmental health and safety, like being on the return to work committee and figuring out how to make the office safe, and screen people and protect people's privacy. Like compliance has a role to play there for sure, especially if the company doesn't have built out crisis management or EHS protocols.
Right.
Another one is supply chain. Like a lot of compliance teams get involved in third-party risk management for sure, but they come at it a lot of times from a bribery and corruption perspective, or a privacy or a fraud perspective, and not from a solvency of the third party's perspective. So I've seen some compliance teams lean in with procurement and be like, I can help you analyze the risk. Like, where's our supply chain going to break? Like, who's going to go bankrupt? Like, we can help you do some of that analysis because it's actually very similar to compliance, other types of compliance due diligence.
Great point. And I think as, an organization is such a complex thing, and there's so much overlap between departments, and we erect these walls because people need to specialize, but in erecting them, sometimes you end up splitting the baby, so to speak, and a process that lands on one side, to your point, maybe has another sort of appendage that never gets looked at where it could be more efficient. So in kind of flexing into those opportunities, not only can you knock down some of those walls, but you can also kind of, again, add more value to these other people that may have a blind spot or something. And, as you were kind of describing that, we had a few clients who kind of seized it as well, because they really leaned into the hotline, and they spun up some special hotlines that were just COVID based.
Yep.
And they had the tool in place that we could, very easily expand out to address some things that some other folks absolutely cared about, but maybe they weren't thinking about for, on the top of their list, because they had, their own fires to put out. You know what I mean?
Yep. 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 I've seen a lot of that too.
Yeah. So let's as we kind of get close to wrapping up here, like 10 years from now, like you've been in this game for 10 plus years, you've seen a ton of change, I imagine, over the last 10 years. As you look toward, if you pull out your crystal ball, 2030, what has compliance been able to do, and how has it been able to sort of, like, what's the new avatar? What's the new reputation of compliance? What have we been able to turn it into as it's formed and grown into its adolescent, state, so to speak?
Sure. I hope it's what we're talking about so far. Like, I hope it's chief of helping the company be who they say they're going to be. I hope that's it. And I hope that the role sort of expands, and I hope you see some chief compliance officers, or chief compliance and ethics officers, or chief ethics officers step into a role like that combines a lot of the best elements of compliance, ethics, and HR and DEI into something that's a little bit different. I hope it's that. I think that over the next 10 years, all assurance functions, and not just compliance, but legal, privacy, risk, audit, will all get better at using data and connecting data points across functions. So right now, like, so much of the data that's being collected sits in silos. I mean, I still
Yeah.
talk to clients where, like, HR has one set of allegations data and compliance has the other set, and rationalizing those two things is, super difficult. And so I think there's all of these different silos of data that exist within your average corporation that are being accumulated and collected, but they're not talking to each other. And I think that some companies are starting to get better at pooling some of that information into, like, a data lake, and being able to make sense of data point A plus data point B equals here's where our risk is increasing, right? Connecting our finance data to our hotline data, to our training data, to our, customer complaints data, and being able to do that in a more seamless way. And I can tell you, like, there's a million different vendors out there that are tackling that. But I actually think it's less about technology and more about process and breaking down some of those barriers internally.
Or mindset even. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think those would be my two picks. Would be a broader definition of ethics in particular that includes some of these other areas that maybe aren't in your average chief compliance ethics officer's portfolio right now, towards a chief of helping the company be their best selves. And then I think better use of data in a way where you can get more predictive in where risk might occur, risk events might occur, rather than just, like, backward looking in a lot of the analysis.
Yeah. So, not driving in the rear view mirror, but having some real kind of like leading indicators by connecting this stuff. And again, like this picture that you painted, you kind of alluded to it on a micro level, just by within the compliance department, looking at the training versus the hotline, or connecting that stuff, to your point, gives so many insights, and we can really help kind of accelerate up that curve by just starting to do it in our own little corner of the world.
Yep. That's probably a good place good tagline to end on.
Yeah. You want to make the world a better place, start by cleaning your desk. You know what I'm saying? So Billy, this has been a really great episode, man. I learned so much. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot of your own words coming from my mouth. So I will try to credit you where I can. But how can people find you? How can people connect with you and see more of your stuff and, learn more from you?
Yeah, sure. So william.hughes@gartner.com if you want to shoot me a quick note about something that you found interesting. I guess maybe we can post my LinkedIn, in the episode notes or whatever. But I'm always up for these kinds of conversations, talking about the future and, what makes C&E departments better. So feel free to reach out, anybody.
Well, I just appreciate you coming on. I appreciate how generous you've been with your wisdom and your tips. This is really a phenomenal episode, and kind of a great embodiment of everything that this whole podcast is supposed to be. So appreciate you, and we will see you soon, my man.
Awesome. I hope to be back. So maybe you'll invite me back after the first time.
Yeah, I think you got another one coming, bud.
All right. Thanks,
Yeah.
Nick.